access to education, access to information is the foundational human right for our liberation. And you can look throughout history, all the revolutions have begun because the public has had access to information that was withheld from them. And that is the most liberating act we can give, is to provide access to information, to make it accessible, and to empower people that this is their information as well. This is theirs to use and to deconstruct and to destroy if they will, and to rebuild. These are their Lego pieces.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Celine Semaan. Celine is a Lebanese-Canadian researcher, designer, public speaker, and entrepreneur. She's the co-founder and executive director of Slow Factory, an institute and lab that transforms socially and environmentally harmful systems by designing models that are good for the earth and good for people. And they are really practicing what they preach over at Slow Factory. They've been on my periphery for a while now. They create a huge amount of open source education and information for the public and also for the rest of the movement. And they've never been afraid of tackling big challenges or really confronting the reality that we can't just switch to something to make all this go away. The breakdown that we're all experiencing and that the earth is experiencing is the product of violence, hundreds, if not thousands of years of violence. As you'll hear me say to Celine during the episode, I think part of Slow Factory's success speaks to the fact that the public are desperate for nuanced, critical discussion and are sick of being infantilized with slogans. This is a marvelous conversation that covers the big picture incredibly well, with Celine explaining the connection between colonialism and our economic system, and even revealing independent research that she did on old colonial shipping routes and current routes of extraction around the world. She talks about the violence of mineral extraction and the accelerating dependence on these finite resources around the world as we accelerate towards the deadline of 2030, which is supposedly the year until which we can still mitigate the effects of heating and erosion. She then explains Slow Factory's work, their invitation to radical imagination that encourages people to unlearn a huge amount of information, think about what should come next, and get effective at building it. She explains the strategies of providing education and information, that what sets Slow Factory apart is the rejection of bureaucracy, the fact that they provide a huge amount of information that is open source, not just for the public, but for other organizations, and that they understand that not changing is a risk. This takes us on very beautifully into a conversation about change and about the morality of those who are afraid of change, looking at it as a biological survival mechanism, and how we need to have stories and tools and systems lying around as everything continues to crumble around us, so that when our backs are finally against the wall, we can deploy certain strategies into certain models in order to survive what comes next. And as Celine explains, this is about designing with risk as a central issue. Models that are lo-fi, low cost, teachable, and importantly, repeatable. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community, who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Celine, thank you so much for joining me on Planet Critical. It is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm really excited to have you. As I said before we started recording, Slow Factory has been in my periphery for a long time. So I was really glad when that dizzying article kind of like brought us together. But to dive right in straight away, Celine, why is the world in crisis?
That is the $1 million question. Why is the world in crisis? For us at Slow Factory, the way we justify or understand the climate crisis, the polycrisis that we're experiencing, the rise in violence for access to resources, genocide in multiple countries, all related to access to resources, is directly connected to colonialism. And oftentimes we look at colonialism as a thing in the past, something that we have declared our independence from. But colonialism is not a thing of the past. It's an economic reality, and it is visible and traceable, and also the explanation of climate disasters. Because if you trace all resources that are needed in the global north, cobalt, chocolate, coffee, cotton, silk, metals, it all connects again to colonial routes. And that is a first study that I've created and publicized in 2018, that shows the correlation between colonial routes and current exploitation routes, if you will, because these exploitation routes are not designed to be equitable for the countries that are serving as resources for the global north. There's also a new route that is being, traced, if you will. It's the waste route. So, waste coming out of the global north and going into the global south. Again, a form of a green colonialism, if you will, because the global north can claim, managing waste in a proper way. Well, while what it's doing actually, it's exporting it to the global south, countries that are bearing the burden of this overconsumption and over production of items, and are also, being the ones receiving this waste as well. So again, in simple form, it's colonialism.
Excellent. That's a very kind of big picture snapshot of where we are. And of course, colonialism with the addition or discovery of coal and oil and gas, because there's only so much you can really do with a bunch of wooden ships kind of roaming the earth. Really, that access to that energy pulse, as Nate Higgins would call it, absolutely changed the geopolitical game forever. And we're still living under its shadow.
Exactly. And what's going on right now is that because of climate disaster and climate collapse, because we are living the final years, if you will, according to the United Nations and climate scientists' consensus, we have up until 2030 to lower the carbon emissions that are responsible for the overheating of the planet, and lower the degrees in which the planet is overheating, so that we can slow down the erosion, if you will, of the planet. Because we are in the last years, if you will, because 2030 is in what, 4 years from now,
Yeah.
5 years from now, we are experiencing an acceleration of this dependence on these finite resources that you're mentioning: coal, gas, oil. Um, and because of the sort of the green tech growth that we're seeing as well, there is an additional dependence on minerals that are coming out of the Congo, out of Sudan, out of Gaza, even. And so these natural resources that are um, essentially needed for a green tech revolution, they're also part of the problem, if you will, in terms of accelerating damages on the planet because of over extraction. And not only that, as Slow Factory works a lot in the intersection between climate justice and human rights, the two are interconnected. When we are talking specifically about mining, for instance, we're mining the earth, but they're also doing it with forced labor. There's also a massive human rights violation around these mines. And we're seeing it in the Congo. What's going on right now in the Congo for the exploitation of cobalt mining, that is one of the many minerals that are being exploited. There is a disaster, a human rights disaster that surrounds this exploitation of these minerals that are needed for the green tech revolution. So climate justice, human rights are two sides of the same coin, if you will.
It speaks to this global picture of the requisite earth justice, because unlike, economic well-being, violence does trickle down. And so if we build these systems of violence, of exploitation and extraction from the earth, and then of course there will be one human group that is then put into that system of extraction, and then another, and then another, and then another, until you have essentially a world in which the vast majority of living beings, whether human or not, are living with violence, so that a very, very, very small group can insulate themselves as much as possible, which is a violence in and of itself that they are kind of inflicting upon themselves. And so it seems very clear, talking about colonialism and the history of this, like climate justice and human justice, it's because also there needs to be a justice for just the appreciation of life and living beings and the respect to leave well alone.
Yes, exactly. And so there are so many things we need to unlearn, right? It's so overwhelming to look at the big picture. It's overwhelming to understand that we are in an accelerated pace towards a climate collapse because some of us in the global south have already experienced it firsthand,
Yeah.
right? So many communities in the global south are already in the
Yeah.
near future experiencing this climate disaster where there's no water access, there is no food access, there is an a pollution of air, water, and land where it's very, very hard to grow anything.
Yeah.
There is an acceleration, if you will, that is happening at the moment that some of us, especially in the global south, are already on the front line. So it's very overwhelming, right, to experience these things and to even witness them and to understand them. So the exercise right now is to invite folks to engage in radical imagination into what is it then that we are building for. And
Yes.
in order for us to get there, it's very important for us to identify some of the things that we need to unlearn. And you mentioned some of them. One of them is the idea that it is about survival, it is about scarcity, it is about protecting your clan versus the other clan. It's very tribal in a way where you're mentioning some countries are going to try to protect certain things so that they can have access to them. And ultimately, we cannot just have liberation for a few at
Yeah.
the expense of the majority. That is not liberation, it's the illusion of. And we can't also claim democracy and progress on the backs and bones of the majority of the world laboring for that illusion of
Yeah.
freedom, liberation, equality for the few. So there are certain things that absolutely need to be unlearned. And for us to build a curriculum around what is it that we are unlearning together, Slow Factory put together something called Open EDU, where we provide hundreds of classes. It's peer to peer learning, extremely accessible ways to understand things that are not taught to you at school. So we like to say it's what school won't teach you. And it's a moment of unlearning that is necessary in the invitation to imagine and create this possible future, this near future that collectively we can work on. So often we're feeling overwhelmed, like we can't do anything about it, but there are so many things that we can actually do about it.
I think it's brilliant what you're doing at the Slow Factory, emblematic of the way that you've spoken so eloquently about the problem and with such empathy as well. And I would like to get into exactly how it is that you are successfully communicating such nuanced ideas whilst also reaching a really, really, really big audience. Because I think this is what maybe sets apart organizations like the Slow Factory from some of the styles of activism that maybe we've seen recently that have essentially been boiled down to certain strategies and certain slogans and certain logos, which only really capture a snippet. One of them would be certainly in the United Kingdom, Just Stop Oil. A huge respect for those people that are putting their bodies on the line, but the problem is not a question of fossil fuels. And for activists sort of claiming it's a question of fossil fuels that really takes the heat off of and moves the focus away as well from communities in the global south who are experiencing a huge amount of violence in order to have access to their land, to the minerals in their land, to their water, etc., everything that is needed for the green transition. And so how is it that Slow Factory has sort of managed this to invite people into what is a difficult practice and communicate really complicated ideas? And what do you think that speaks to or says to how the public are considered as being incapable, perhaps, of receiving these kinds of messages or even being in a collaborative dialogue, like in sort of the ancient Greek agora? And do you think that part of the complexity of what you're communicating is why people have been attracted to follow you?
So many questions in one, but
Yeah,
I think
sorry.
it's okay. It boils down to communication, right? It boils down to education and making these two, you know, fields accessible, rendering them accessible. I think that part of the success of having been able to reach such a large audience and communicate complexity in a way that people can understand it, and not just understand it, but also take part in it. It's an invitation to participation. I think that one of the main criteria for this type of success is that we are not upholding bureaucracy as we are doing this. So often when you are working in a not-for-profit, industrial complex, let's say, there is a risk in talking about these complex things. And often institutions are uphold the institution before they uphold the message itself. And for us at Slow Factory, the institution is very young. There is no institution, if you will. It could collapse tomorrow and still provide a blueprint for others to engage in this type of access to information. And as you've seen, Slow Factory's blueprint is all over the internet, the ways in which we lay out information, even all the way to the usage of fonts, colors, and layout. We've already given an open source framework for communication to hundreds of organizations that are borrowing the language, borrowing the visual aesthetic, borrowing the design, because this type of design was intentional. When we designed our post, when we designed our communication strategy, the one and the central thing we wanted to uphold was the access to information, as opposed to upholding the institution or upholding the bureaucracy of the institution. So for us, we are looking at risk as another form. Like, risk for us is not upholding Slow Factory in perpetuity, which is what most institutions care about, is their institutions to live in perpetuity. We are very happy to have Slow Factory become obsolete in a near future, where we don't need Slow Factory anymore, because we have achieved a milestone collectively. And I think that's where it's different than other institutions, where their existence in perpetuity, sorry, is more important than the change they want to create, because their existence through generations and generations, in fact, is the very problem and is the colonial institutional problem, because ultimately, at the end of the day, change is a risk. Where for Slow Factory, the risk is no change, the risk is the status quo. And we are at a point now with Slow Factory where we are in a deep transformation, where we are slowing down. We are going on a sabbatical, because the time that we're taking now is around imagination and building offline. And to do that offline, after we've successfully accelerated the awareness online and provided tools for communities to take, basically community-led tools and participation, where community feels entitled and excited to take on this acceleration of awareness online, narrative change, in other words. We are taking another strategy, where we are now accelerating the work that we've been doing offline. And in order to do that, it takes another type of strategy that we are exploring at the moment. So to answer your question, is that risk is somewhere else for us. The risk is not where the status quo is. The risk is at the opposite end of status quo. And I think that also not worshipping bureaucracy has
Mm-hmm.
allowed us to be really, really effective in
Mm-hmm.
our approach.
That's excellent. And I think that there is a huge movement at the moment across whether or not it's NGOs, whether or not it's NGOs who maybe historically have also been part of the problem, but do genuinely have quite willing people. You know, you don't tend to go into this sort of sector unless you do, at least at base, have a good heart and want to make change. That people think there's got to be something else. It cannot just be this sort of these top-down frameworks, trotting ourselves out at conferences, saying the same things over and over again, and spending a huge amount of time as well meeting with funders or going through paperwork in order to just keep trudging along. And people really want to get back to the ground because, you know, we're starting to become aware that actually the violence in this system isn't really going to go away, and things are probably going to continue to erode and to continue to break down. And it's in that breaking down, it's in that erosion that there will be more problems and there will be more violence. But if we can prepare ourselves with pockets of resistance, pockets of liberation, pockets of new models of how to do things, and we can have good ideas lying around, as some people say, then that might actually stand us in a better stead. And that has to be done offline.
Mm-hmm. You know, you said something that's really interesting for me to riff off of on is that
Please.
in not for profits, there's a lot of people with good hearts, good intentions, yes. But ultimately, as the majority of people are afraid of change, you know, we're
Yeah.
calling a
Yeah.
change that we are
Yeah.
collectively afraid of. Even on a
Yeah.
personal level, for instance, let's say you want to change your habits. It takes so long to change something that doesn't work for you anymore. You don't just suddenly embark on a new trajectory unless you are forced to. And sometimes it does happen, but that's not the majority of experience in the ways in which we relate. As human beings, we love a routine. We love the predictable. We are extremely uncomfortable with what's unpredictable. And now we are in a climate where everything is unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
And we are bombarded with unpredictable news, unpredictable situations. And there are very little tools for the majority of people to adapt to this change. And that is what is interesting right now is that how do we embrace change? It doesn't matter the good or bad intentions, really. It is an invitation to be open to change and be open to changing yourself as well. As I mentioned earlier, I spoke about unlearning. The unlearning, the action of introspection and looking within and connecting with others that are on this path with you requires a level of openness, of vulnerability, of curiosity that is needed at the moment. These are the skills that we are looking for when we are engaging in transformation or collective liberation or change on a societal level. And it all boils down to how we relate to change personally and collectively. So I think that right now there is a massive change, and it's not that something that I think, it's a fact. There is a massive change in non-for-profit in the industry of non-for-profits, particularly in the United States, but also across Europe, because there is a rise of right-wing leadership across the board. It's not just the United States. And because there is a rise of right wing leadership, the funds that are going towards humanitarian and climate aid are diminishing. In the United States, particularly under this new administration, there has been severe cuts, and you've seen them in the news. USAID, um, not for profits that are now on the FBI most wanted lists, that are working with the most vulnerable populations in the world. There are non for profits that are at risk of being labeled a terrorist organization for serving in areas of the world that are deemed dangerous or terrorist like, according to the United States. So there is a massive change when it comes to non for profits at the moment. And that means financially, and that means major cuts, major people, a major amount of people being laid off, furloughed from their organizations. And that's a big crisis that no one is talking about that is happening currently. What does that mean? That means that these non-for-profits that were upholding the system, upholding the bureaucracy, upholding the structure of power, are crumbling. And it's
Yeah.
inviting the majority of people to embark on change as we want to see it, because the reason there are non-for-profits is because we're filling the gap of a system that isn't inclusive, that isn't built on equity. And so the gap is getting bigger, and the invitation is getting bigger as well. So we need more folks to put their time, energy, skills into action so that they bridge that gap.
I think that it's really important here to dig deeper into this. Change is scary because, and this is a conversation I've been having quite a lot on the show recently, is that this isn't a particularly moral problem. There are some absolute immoral bastards out there who are actively, making more harm in order to reap more reward. But most of the system is just ticking on over as it should, and people are doing what they think is best. And there are certain things that are actually quite understandable, like having an energy surplus. It's actually quite understandable for human beings and actually most other living creatures to seek out an energy surplus with which to, maintain themselves. Having shelter, or having things be stable, having things be the same. The more that your routine and your environment is the same, the more that you can venture out into the world intellectually, or the more that you can build together societally, civilizationally. And so for those who still feel frightened not only by what's coming, but feel, whether it's good or bad, but feel frightened about making that shift as well. It's not a moral question. For
Mhm.
people that are kind of scared of making the change, or at the moment still unwilling to, it's not that you have particular moral failures. It's a perfectly reasonable biological precedent to not seek out a huge amount of risk, because that is how we keep ourselves alive. And it's really interesting to think about how we can sort of use this like countdown to 2030 as a way of inviting people to feel their backs up against the wall, because human beings tend to not really change until their backs up against the wall. And then also when they see that there is this other path available to them. You can stay with your back against the wall, or you can even shimmy across the wall like a crab, left or right, just somewhere, go somewhere, do something. And that's why I think it's really important that there are these avenues. People that have thought ahead of time, who have been working on this for a long time, have these like pockets where people can run to when they need to, because people will need to. But it's perfectly fine as well if you are too scared to right now.
Exactly. And I think that what you're saying is really interesting, to look at risk, right? You're saying like people don't want to engage in too much risk, but now the risk is overpowering
Yeah.
the sense of morality, the sense of normalcy. There is no normal. Like we
Yeah.
always knew there was no normal, there was an illusion of normalcy, but now risk is becoming central. And how do we design with risk as a central issue, if you will? Because, like I said, the risk is greater if we try to maintain things as they are, as they
Yes.
were. Because the things that they were, how things were damaging to the environment, were damaging to humankind. The ways in which we behaved and operated and upheld even these beliefs of success and wealth and all of
Yeah.
these things have been built against our own survival. So, how do we unlearn that? And how do we quickly manage to build a new paradigm that embraces this idea of risk and perhaps changes it, because the risk is greater if we sort of put our head in the sand? And so, how do we build these types of frameworks? And that is what we are interested in. This is the study that we are engaged in, and for the past 15 years have been engaged in. Some of us are able to plan ahead while others wait to be in the last minute.
Yeah.
For those of us who have been heavily invested in building ahead, there are some strategies. We are able to articulate strategies and put strategies together that require sometimes a leadership engagement. So, for instance, we would need government to embark on it, but many of these strategies rely on a change of culture, on a change of behavior from the public first. And so, this is the dilemma that we are, in now is that how do we put, is it the egg or the chicken or stuff like that, you know? So it is both at the same time. We need to change culture, change behavior, and at the same time get leadership to either change completely or adopt these types of new strategies. For instance, you've spoken about energy and hoarding energy. Energy is we have the technology to be able to create energy that does not require these finite resources. This technology is available right now. It's out there. There are technologies that are ready to be deployed or have been deployed in a way or another that do not require exploitation, that,
Which ones?
for example, creating energy based on waste. You know,
Mm.
there are several avenues in that field, if you will, where energy is being created on waste or being created on natural elements, on the usage of natural elements, light, wind, motion in water, etc. So it's not that we are at a blank state where we have no idea. There are people who have worked tirelessly. However, switching to these other energies will create a crash economically for the most wealthiest folks that don't yet have a stake in the new technologies, that don't yet have a stake in capitalizing on these new technologies. That's the problem. It's not that there isn't any solution. The solutions exist. Is how fast can we create a capitalistic system around them so that it is put into place, or do we want to do that again, you know?
Well, these solutions, quote unquote, do exist, but the deployment, the mining requirement for minerals for the green energy, wind and solar, could also trigger a biodiversity crisis that is worse than the climate crisis. And that's what climate scientists have come out, and the UN as well. They did a working group on this that was published in, I think, 2023 to kind of warn about this. So I think that there is part of the difficulty of the situation is saying to people, the world could be better. Of course it could be better, because I mean, how many of us are happy and fulfilled, and how many of us are living with violence? But it isn't going to look like this, because there isn't actually a way to sort of use this amount of energy and deploy this amount of energy without extracting from someone or something, some kind of organism somewhere.
Well, there's nuclear energy. There are other types of
Yeah,
energy. The problem that we're facing is the uh, basically looking at it like a one thing solution.
yeah,
It has to be diverse. It has to be a
yeah,
diverse solution where we're not just relying on one thing, but we are relying on multiple things. And that, I
yeah.
think, is where we're interested in exploring. For instance, it's not going to be one technology that's going to replace another, but a series of, and a decentralization of
Yes.
these resources. There's also the need to slow down. There is a behavioral change that is asked
Mhm.
of the public, of communities. This reliance on these technologies. For example, I live in New York, and this is literally the city that never sleeps. We're using energy to put out, to use light, just like electricity, in empty buildings 24/7. You know, those buildings could be turned
Mhm.
off, you know, like we could, there are ways where we can explore a hybrid solution in the interim, as well as slowing down the usage of these technologies, or these this reliance, sorry, on fossil fuel for electricity, because ultimately that is the main point, is our dependence on fossil fuel for energy, like electricity, in large cities like New York, for example, and others, where it never shuts off. And these are empty buildings with the lights on 24/7 that are using fossil fuel energy that could very well be uh, looked at in another way.
But if they weren't using fossil fuel energy right now under the same system, then they would be using a sort of solar, wind, hydro, whatever it is, and those minerals could be coming out of all these places that you said at the beginning: the Congo, Sudan. I don't know about minerals in Gaza, but I know about the gas off the coast of
Yes, that's
Gaza.
right.
Like, and so the villain isn't fossil fuels, which is just, old organic life that was compressed over millions of years, and then we figured out how to burn it. It's not also not minerals. It's, as you said, it's this colonial attitude of entitlement, of man's divine right, of patriarchy, of this willingness to hoard and to amass in order to feel safe as well. And so when you were talking about, what do we do and how do we create this kind of like double pronged solution of like, we need government to do this and we need people to do this. That's why I'm so excited about seeing community action that essentially tries to do both, which is, okay, we can't get there, and it's very unlikely that government up there is going to change just because of the intersection of all of our financial services and all of our energy systems. Like, that's probably just going to have to come tumbling down. And yes, we can ask the public to change, but I mean, how you even begin a communication campaign around that without that sense of real physical urgency is very difficult. And communities that are actually deploying their own local economies and local energy solutions and, creating mutual aid networks, they're doing both. And by changing their behavior and taking responsibility for their future, they're creating a sovereignty as well. They're creating their own sense of not government, but governance. And that, for me, I think really it's what gives me a sense that there is a light at the end of this tunnel. That even when all of the top-down structures come tumbling down, which they will most likely do, the fact that people will still be able to band together and use their imagination to solve their own problems is really exciting.
Exactly. Yes. That's where we are the most excited about as well and invested in, is really empowering communities to radically imagine and transform, unlearn, and put together frameworks that are repeatable, that are low cost. For so many of these frameworks are, you know, uh, teachable, repeatable, and low cost enough, lo-fi enough to be able to be distributed. But there are also other, frameworks that are being deployed that are at a larger scale than just like a smaller community. And that's also interesting. I feel like it's a yes and response here, a yes and. And again, to go back to what we were saying, there needs to be an unlearning, and there needs to be a behavioral change. No matter what these solutions are, as you mentioned, like, yes, we can replace fossil fuel with something else. But if we are still putting together an excess of usage, as we are seeing today, because that's the problem, is the excess of usage and uh, the the wasteful use of energy, lighting up buildings in the global south where there's not one person living in them, while there's a you know a houseless community that is on the street, for instance. Like, there's so much injustice that could be looked at and resolved before we decide, oh yes, we're going to replace all of this with this one formula that is a one-stop shop. I think there's the diversification, the pluralism of these solutions that is also at the opposite end of colonialism, because colonialism and colonial thought wants one thing and one thing. Well, they want the startup that's replacing all of these other little services that communities rely upon. But at the opposite end of this ideology, there is the plurality of our experience, the biodiversity, if we want to look at it from a biological perspective. But there's also the biodiversity of thought, of solutions, of experiments. And that is something that we must allow, and center. There's not one solution, but 100 million solutions that we can look into at the same time.
I completely agree with you. I wonder if you want to have a very little specific conversation, maybe for our last little bit, because a verb that you've used and also a noun, unlearn, and unlearning or to unlearn. And I'd love to know how it was that you guys landed on using this, because I really don't like this word. I'd love for you to help me figure it out, actually, while we're doing this here.
Why don't you like it?
Because I don't think we do need to unlearn. I think we need to learn from our past. And I think we need to learn our lessons. And I think that it's not about kind of undoing what has been done, because there is no undoing. I think it's about taking a kind of radical accountability for mistakes that were not our own, but are millennia of mistakes, and doing better and building out, essentially.
Yes, I can, I'm not attached to the word to unlearn, but there is something about unlearning that is a rejection of. And in terms of decolonial thought, and again, I'm not using decoloniality or decolonizing as a metaphor here, but when we are looking at decolonizing, it is about the land back. It is about a taking back. And one of the first actions about a decolonial perspective is to refuse, to reject, to say, no, I don't want to learn this. I don't want this. This past that you imposed on me is not something I want, or I want to keep forward, or I want to keep upholding, or that I want to give it justice. And that's where the unlearning happens. A lot of communities of the global majority are interested in unlearning what has been forced upon them to learn, what has been imposed in their educational system that was colonized by various countries in the global north that took pieces and parts of Africa and the Middle East and Asia and imposed a learning framework that we want to unlearn. We don't want to keep that learning framework. That learning framework is serving the colonial agenda by making us believe that whatever ancestry we held was wrong, was bad, was evil, even to a point where our traditional indigenous wisdom was villainized and criminalized. That is something we must unlearn. There is a rejection that needs to happen here, where we say this was not, this was wrong. This was wrong to believe that my ancestral wisdom is evil or is discredited by default, because we need to have the white gaze upon us. So, this is where unlearning is useful as a word. And this is where the rejection of it and the defiance against this educational system happens and is allowed in our framework for building radical imagination, not on the old paradigms, but on really this idea. Also, I've studied philosophy, and one of the main things in philosophy is to be able to start from a blank slate, to be in the tabula rasa space where all the things that we've known in the past are no longer valid. Where do we start today? And there is this inherent form of unlearning here when even the greatest philosophers are allowed themselves this space to reject whatever was an idea, a framework, a tradition that was imposed upon them, so that they can have the space to imagine and create a new understanding with a new perspective on the matter. I understand that sometimes words can be not incomplete. The language is so limiting and limited, and especially as we're communicating only in English in this interview, for example, where multiple times I had other words in other languages that were popping in my mind that would help me explain what is it that we are trying to create. But unfortunately, I am limited to the English language for the purpose of this interview, where again the unlearning comes really. It's easy for me to just say unlearning because English right now, and many people just speak one language and they speak mostly English. And it is taught to us that English is the most important language in the world so that we can communicate and have a business and so on and so forth, while the erasure of other languages hold tremendous information for our humanities. Every time an indigenous language is not being spoken, we are losing hundreds of years of data, of information that is inherent into our survival on this planet. So again, there is this need to learn these new aspects. And for us to make space to learn these new aspects, we must reject other things in order for us to open up our curiosity, our mind, our vulnerability to something that is quite unknown. And so that's where I would position it. But again, I'm not um, arguing for it. If there is another word that makes more sense, I'm more than happy to embrace it.
Do you have a word in a different language that that means unlearning, but perhaps has a different sense to it?
I would have to think about that because I mostly am using unlearning in the English language, but there were other words earlier that popped into my mind when we were talking about, uh, you know, about different things, and particularly words in Arabic or in French that were coming to me that were, describing certain situations. Right now, I I don't have them right there for me to be able to. It's like speak your language, and you're like, what do I say? But earlier, as we were talking, there were some words that were popping into my mind. For example, gaspillage in French, gaspiller,
Waste, wastage.
waste, like we are engaging in a great gaspillage of energy right now, especially when we're talking about the usage of fossil fuel, and why we could be using fossil fuel and other energies, for example, and just distribute the harm, if you will. But it's just, now you're putting me on the spot. I don't have
Oh,
other words.
je m'excuse.
Ah, tu parles français aussi?
Oui, oui, je parle français, mais ça fait un bail que je ne parle pas, donc
Oh non, c'est bien, mais c'est juste le mot gaspillage came. The word
c'est enough.
gaspillage, it's to
Yeah.
waste.
I think it's a great word, gaspillage. It has a sense of enormity with it, that waste, even just the sense of waste being like a single syllable word, and you don't have to put much effort into it. Was gaspillage, there is a drama there that I think speaks to, I mean, what pollution is and what we're doing to the planet. I completely agree with
Absolutely.
you.
There's no equivalent of that
No.
word in English, for example, where it is, as you said, dramatic, because it's dramatic, you know?
I was trying to think what it would be, what unlearn would be in French, like déapprendre, because I know degrowth, décroissance,
Mm,
but I'm not sure.
c'est great question. I want to meditate on that. I don't know it now, but I would love to uh, translate that word. And how would it translate?
Yeah.
Um, I mean, in Arabic, we
Yeah.
have, it's not necessarily a word, but it's an attitude that is often discrediting whatever, colonial information is being imposed, and
Oh, cool.
it's just like an attitude that inherently discredits it and pushes it aside to be like, well, we'll look at it later, but this is not truth with a capital T just yet, because I want to study it first.
Yeah.
But it's more like an attitude and a defiance that is, it's basically according to who. According to who. And often when we embody these types of colonial paradigms, we are called out. Sure, now you are a French person, now you are an American person, now you are letting go of your identity and of your knowledge, for you forgot who you are, basically. But it's 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 not like all of us use it. There's definitely, and I talk a lot about it in my book, A Woman is a School, which came out September 2024. It's a small book, but it's papier.
Brilliant.
But I talk a lot about internalized colonialism in this book, and how communities in the global South have taken on and internalized certain ideologies that are harmful and that continue to divide them, and allow for this divide and conquer, continue to divide communities, and embracing certain paradigms that separate us from each other. So internalized colonialism is very real as well. We have so much to unlearn as communities of color as well.
I had an extraordinary moment interviewing a room. They were sitting in a line of Afro-Colombian women who had obviously were displaced historically, which is how their grandmothers and great-grandmothers ended up in Colombia, and they were displaced again because of the violence between the junta and the militia and the government. And I interviewed them on this rooftop that they run as this kind of like restaurant for their peers and for their communities. And they have created, in partnership with a community center, sort of this course that they do about colonialism and about racism and things that they didn't have words for before they went to that course. And this one woman said, and I will never forget this, she said, before doing that course, I would have never been able to look you in the eyes. And that was absolutely heartbreaking. And I mean, it's just something that I think is maybe, especially as a Westerner, particularly as having the privilege of being, educated. I did my sort of liberal arts education, sort of going, these are not just, I'm aware of all these concepts. I understand the history of them. I know how they work still in practice. And to see still the weight of it as if it was 500 fucking years ago for this woman who is 3 decades older than me, who is an elder, really, technically, to say, I wouldn't even have been able to look you in the eyes before I learned about all of these things. Like, all of that knowledge was in her body. It was her lived experience, and she didn't have language for it. Just extraordinary.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that beautiful, impactful story. I think that access to education, and just to tie a bow on our discussion and going back to the beginning, access to education, access to information is the foundational human right for our liberation. And you can look
Yes.
throughout history, all the revolutions have begun because the public has had access to information that was withheld from them. And that is the most liberating act we can give, is to provide access to information, to make it accessible, and to empower people that this is their information as well. This is their, this is theirs to use and to to deconstruct and to destroy if they will, and to rebuild. These are their Lego pieces
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. To take back,
to
land
take back.
back,
Exactly.
language back, life
Mhm.
back. Celine, I'm aware of the time. I'm going to have to let you go. But my final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
I would love to platform my dear, dear friend Najla Saeed, who is the daughter of Edouard Saeed, who wrote a book as well not too long ago about Palestine, about her life in and out of Palestine. She is an incredible thinker. I'm actually going to see her this evening speak in Brooklyn. I would love for her to speak from her perspective, because she's an incredible um, scholar and artist and actress and so many different things. So Najla Saeed.
Thank you so much. And Celine, thank you for this absolutely wonderful conversation. It was brilliant speaking with
Thank you
you.
so much for having me on your podcast. Thank you so much.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.